Hey friends, it's Sureshni Rada. Welcome to another edition of All Accounting For, proudly brought to you by Boston Media Broadcasts. This session, of course, as always, I'm in the house with Bee, and she represents the Faculty of Accounting. As usual, let's break it down for you on what exactly you're going to expect in this week's episode of All Accounting For. We look at everything when it comes to accounting in this particular showcase. It's basically breaking down the numbers and the rules and the latest news for you in a way that's so easy to digest. It's like having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning. We want to make it as easy peasy as possible. We have something called Bottom Line Bulletin. In this particular segment, we cover the latest in accounting news. We're always trying to look at what's happening in the industry and relate it back to what you are actually studying. For Credit Where It's Due, it's a personal favorite because we look at an actual story of an actual trailblazer, a personal profile where we highlight a powerhouse in the industry. And in Ledger Lowdown, this is a corporate segment where we evaluate the industry and how it actually works. And as always, the most important thing is bringing it back. How does it affect your studies and how do you align with the content that you're just learning? Stay put, get excited. This is All Accounted For. Let's talk Bottom Line Bulletin. And like I said, we're looking at different industries. We've looked at the airline industry. We've looked at the banking industry. This is something that B is super passionate about. It's big farm. We're talking about South African pharmacy chain Clicks to sell drug maker after court ruling. Now here's something very interesting. South Africa's biggest pharmacy chain Clicks, the Clicks Group, said it will sell drug maker Unicorn Pharmaceuticals to comply with a court ruling, clearing the way for the health ministry to issue the company with licenses for new stores. B, what is the situation with Clicks versus Unicorn Pharmaceuticals?
What happened was Unicorn Pharmaceuticals is basically a subsidiary of Clicks, right? And so you had a few people that were unhappy about that arrangement because Clicks is a pharmacy and yet they also own a company that manufactures the actual medicine or the drugs. And so ethically,
Yes.
it does become kind of blurry there. So you had the South African, it's the Independent Community of Pharmacy Association. They actually took to the Department of Health initially back in 2016 to complain, to say, hey, we have this issue or we have this problem where you get employees from Clicks that are incentivized to offer their own products, right? And the problem that we have with this is that if, for example, a patient has been used or has used some of this medication to then be stabilized by a doctor, whatever the case is, this medicine that is now being manufactured by Unicorn is kind of sectioned off for just Clicks. So Clicks were the only distributors of it. That meant that if you as a patient, if you'd use that medication, you could only get it from Clicks. So obviously that is problematic because if you're in a town or a small city where they don't have Clicks, you would not be able to get that same brand of medication. And so they were saying, it's just unheard of. You should only be looking at two things as a pharmacist, and that is, what is the doctor saying or what is the doctor prescribing? And then secondly, what is the best kind of option for the patient? Just cost-wise and quality-wise. And now if you have the pharmacists that are being incentivized to give their own kind of in-house products, that second leg or that second pillar kind of goes out of the window. And so the Constitutional Court then said, or rather this ICPA then took Clicks to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court ruled in their favor, saying they actually do agree and that Clicks had to then sell off this drug making baby that they had. So this is how we find ourselves here.
Wow, what an interesting story. I had no idea, but you're right. All the questions of ethics, etc., immediately come up. And this is very important, especially in accounting, understanding how these contracts work and how they will have to be dissolved at some point or sectioned off. That was Bottom Line Bulletin. We looked at the South African pharmacy chain Clicks that was selling drug maker after the court ruling. Up next, we've got Credit Where It's Due. This is a segment where we look at the life of a chartered accountant who is now actually chartering the real life world waters and see exactly what they've done with their degree, how they've landed, and how they're navigating these amazing new paths. Today, we like to profile and highlight Tintswalo Masia. Deputy Business Unit Leader for Auditor General of South Africa. Tintswalo Masia started in the work auditing profession and has gained experience in both technical accounting skills and strategic business management. She's also served as a speaker at various conferences where she shares her expertise on the CASA journey and the future of accounting professions. So this is pretty important because I think this is something you start to look at when you wonder, like, okay, I'm studying this, where to from here? She offers really great inspiration. As someone who is deeply committed to education, Tintswalo regularly mentors aspiring chartered accountants, offering guidance on how to manage the demanding CA journey from undergraduate studies to passing the very important psycho exams. She's also passionate about broadening access to the profession, advocating for diversity and inclusion within the CA pipeline. I mean, I love reading about her profile, but more importantly, how she empowers young people along the way. What can you tell us about Tintswalo's experience?
Cool. So recently she was actually profiled in the Accountancy Essay magazine where she shared her life story. And, she speaks about just how challenging it was growing up in a rural village in Limpopo. She also grew up in a polygamous household. So her dad had 2 wives and 10 children all in all. And, like many villages in South Africa, she grew up in a village where the expectation for young girls in particular was just, you don't even have to finish school. You can just go get married and have babies, and that's about it. But she did really well in school, and that's how she actually ended up deciding on accounting. But there were challenges in that her father was a general worker, and at the time she did not know anything about financial aid schemes, NSFAS and the likes. So her father, the only option that they had of funding was that her father was supposed to get a loan, and he did that, and she was able to then go to WITS. Now, during this time, she and her dad had to squat in Soweto. So the living conditions were not ideal. They did not have running water or electricity. So you can just imagine having to study in a situation like that. It wasn't the most conducive, right? In fact, she speaks about how during winter, as someone who lives in Limpopo, I can attest to this. It's always warm here, right? And you now move to Joburg and it's so cold and you don't have winter clothes. And she now had to go to classes, and she actually had to borrow a jersey just so she could make it to class. But, with the whole thing with money being a bit tight, she ended up having to be financially excluded from WITS. And she then had to leave WITS to go and stay at home. Not long after that, maybe about 2 years or so later, she then bumped into someone who actually worked at UJ, and that's when she got to know about NSFAS. This person told her about it and said, you're too academically gifted to just be sitting at home and doing nothing. And that's how she ended up at at UJ.
Yeah.
And that's where she pursued her studies. And, she's just so passionate about giving information, especially within the rural context. So helping those kids understand what their options are and just what heights they can reach if they just dream big enough. And I think also that representation when she then goes back to her village and she says, look at me, this is what I've been able to do. Then the young kids can also see themselves in her. And she's extremely passionate about education, about just empowering young professionals and just Black excellence in general. She's absolutely amazing.
If there's ever a story you need to follow about how an environment should not dictate where you land, just look at that. A girl that pushed all the way through every single hurdle, and she's flying high. She walks the walk and she knows how to talk the talk. I encourage you students to go and find her on Google, go and look at her background, get in touch with someone like that. This is a real life hero. Her name is Tintswalo Masia. That, of course, was called Credit Where It's Due. So in this particular segment of All Accounted For, we call it Ledger Lowdown. Again, we have focused on the airline industry. We've looked at the banking industry. Today, we're looking at pharmaceuticals, and this is a big player, like it's massive. If we look at the South African pharmaceutical market, it was valued at approximately, wait for it, 57 billion rand in 2020, and they had projections with over reaching over 80 billion by 2025. The pharmaceutical industry is a significant employer with an estimate of 9,000 to 10,000 people employed directly in manufacturing, research, and distribution. When including related services, the number, of course, is higher. South Africa is the largest pharmaceutical market in Africa, accounting for around 25% of the continent's pharmaceutical sales. Now, exports are mainly to other African countries and some international markets. The country imports over 60% of its pharmaceutical needs, including active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and finished products from countries like India and China, etc. But B, if you look at this massive pharmaceutical industry and if we look at the facts and figures, who are the major players in the industry?
So in South Africa, you're looking at Aspen, Adcock Ingram, Cipla MedPro, Pfizer, Bayer, GlaxoSmithKline, amongst others. And the regulator within South Africa is actually SAHPRA, which stands for South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. So they deal with the approvals as well as the monitoring of the pharmaceutical industries in particular. And I think as you were just going through the numbers as well, it's also very interesting to note that what drives the growth within pharma in particular is actually, disease, or rather chronic disease, demand for generic substitutes, because some of the medicines are very expensive. We're going to speak a little bit about what generic medicine is actually in a moment, as well as just making sure that there's improvement within the healthcare infrastructure within the country. So if we look at, I was just thinking now when we we're talking about Unicorn earlier. So Unicorn manufactures about 40 generic products, which were initially then sectioned off for clicks. And what a generic medicine is, I think this is a term that you would have heard at some point when you go to the pharmacy, right? It's the definition says, yes, do you want a generic? Or so what actually that means is it's a pharmaceutical drug that contains the same chemical substance as a drug that was originally protected by a chemical patent. So in other words, it's basically a copy of a brand name, right? Where it will be identical either in dosage, in safety, in strength, and such things. And the generic market within South Africa in particular make up around 70% of the volume of sales. Wow. But because they're so cheap, the value within the bigger kind of bucket is a small drop because of that. So yeah, it's a very, very important sector.
Brilliant. Now, B, we recently spoke about the private healthcare sector and how they make money. This one's very interesting. How do pharmaceuticals actually make money?
So within pharmaceuticals, research and development is a big thing, right? So what happens is they're going to now start researching the medicine. What can we use? What diseases are out there? What can we look at? What has been done in the past? So all of that is extremely time consuming and expensive. But once they're successful, these drugs can be highly profitable, right? And once a drug has been then discovered, developed, tested through a clinical trial, only then does it go into the market. So that's one way that they make money. A second way is where they now patent that drug to sell exclusively, right? So what then happens is that they develop this drug, then they secure a patent, and a patent is then usually around 20 years. So for 20 years, once a pharmaceutical has discovered this drug, no one else is supposed to make any copy of it. It's completely protected by law, and that means that they can charge whatever they want, right? But within the South African context in particular, pricing is regulated. There's a concept called single exit price, where they essentially say it doesn't matter who you are, a pharmacy, an independent distributor, you are not allowed to sell a particular medicine for above a certain price, right? So I think that's where where it kind of helps us a bit within the South African context. But in other parts of the world where they may not have such mechanisms, they can essentially charge an arm and a leg for that. And then the third way is now the generics. This is where the generics come in. So once the patent has expired after the 20 years, right? The other little players can then come in and be like, now we want to copy that medicine. We know what's in it. We know how it works. We're going to make a replica of it, and we're going to sell it at a much more cheaper price. And as you can imagine, this is obviously good for you and I as consumers, because this means that we can essentially get the same product for like a cheaper kind of price. But you do then get or rather the question then becomes, the original patent owners, where are they in the equation? We must remember that they've had 20 years to kind of dominate the market. So already people associate that medicine with that brand, right? In the same way that old people will be like, no, I want just Panado. No paracetamol, no name from Clicks, or no name from whatever. Exactly. They just want the Panado. So they still kind of make money off of that, or off of the back of that strength that they were able to aggressively kind of capture the market. And I think it's also interesting to know that while the research in particular is done on a global scale, South Africa is not a big player within the research and the making of new drugs and patenting of drugs. We're very big players within the generic market, which actually works for us, because then we're able to help other African countries and also export our material to other countries as well.
It also comes down to the cost of affordability in the market that we're looking at. If you look at your target audience, they might not have access to those brand name drugs. This is why generics are so much more important and relatable to how much they can afford. Students, if you get the opportunity, go and look at the weight loss market, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, and how everyone is trying to mimic the power of semaglutide, which of course is what people find in the likes of Wegovy and Ozempic. It's a whole weight loss situation around the world, and everybody, including the Kardashians, are all grabbing onto that. And now semaglutide has become the hot topic of the day. So that's a very interesting industry. Now everyone's going to say, while it's not Ozempic, we do have the ingredient semaglutide, and they keep saying that in their T's and C's. So it's such an interesting and massive topic to unpack, and I really hope you go back and go and do some research and unpacking. So Bee, let me ask you this. How is IFRS applicable to the pharmaceutical industry and for students linking to their studies?
So a big one would be IS 38, intangible assets. We did speak about patents earlier. We also spoke about just the research and the development. So then the question becomes, at which point do you start capitalizing this asset, right, for this drug? And students would know from IS 38 that research costs are expense. You don't recognize that as an asset. And then your development costs, that's when you would then start kind of capitalizing based on whether or not it meets the recognition criteria. And then you then need to amortize the cost of that asset over a period of time, say 20 years for a patent or something of that nature. And then I think another important one would be IS 36, intangible assets, impairment of assets. What then happens when the asset that you have is now impaired? Say it fails the drug trials or regulatory changes come into the picture. What does that then mean for your drug, or the value at which you had brought in this drug in your financial statements? You may need to then impair that based on just those kind of factors within the market. Another important one would be IS2, inventories. This is where they now make the actual drugs to sell. So the raw materials that go into that, the labor costs, the work in progress, finished goods, how do they then cost these different drugs to show in their financial statements? And then there's a rule that says you have to measure inventory at cost or net realizable value. And now the question then becomes, for example, if you know, we spoke about this single exit price earlier, if you know that you're not able to sell your drug at a beyond a specific point, for example, or beyond a specific price, that would then represent the maximum amount at which you are then able to sell it for, which would then essentially be your net realizable value. So that is how that concept would play in there. We've also spoken about IFRS 8 operating segments in the past as well, to then say you want to show kind of performance per segment. So we would want to know how Aspen is doing in the branded drugs category, in the generics category, maybe within vaccines or whatever the case is. So a standard like that would then be applicable to them.
Excellent stuff. Thank you so much for explaining that, especially for students to understand how it links to their studies. Up next, we look at another big pillar of accounting: management accounting, strategy, and finance principles. B, what principles actually apply to the study of management accounting, strategy, and finance?
So I think if we just look at, for example, inventory management, right, where they do have inventory, they would then need to look at things such as how should the medicine be stored, expiry dates, that sort of thing. You don't want to obviously overproduce something that has a very short expiry term, right? So these companies would then need to sit and look at the different strategies at which they're going to manage inventory. Are they going to look at just in time, which the students would know something about, as well as what economic order quantity model. So which model would they then follow in making sure that they just manage that inventory aspect of medicine in particular properly? And then I think within strategy, they would then look at things such as, for example, how are they going to price their medicine, right? And I think, having spoken about the fact that essentially a generic and an original or branded medicine is essentially the same thing, it all boils down to marketing and what people perceive the value to be. And so companies kind of need to tap into that and decide how are they going to price their medicine. What is the perceived value of Panado versus paracetamol, name from Discam, whatever the case is.
And if I could interrupt you there, if you look at the cost of items that are pink, I mean, the studies were done about how if you look at a girl's razor versus a boy's razor, like, you look at a normal razor, and because it's packaged in pink and all pretty, apparently those affect, so markets, so like you just mentioned, packaging affects the cost of things. So this is very important, how you market, because when you market in pink, everyone's going to pick it up, even though it's exactly the same thing that the one next to it in yellow serves the exact same purpose, same ingredients, or same structural process, same kind of metal that they're using for the actual razor, whatever it is, whether you're looking at medicine. Look at those kind of things. Maybe it is the ingredients, same ingredients, sometimes the way the box is presented. So I love that you bring it up. That's really clever.
Absolutely. That's such a great example. And I think also, having spoken about how regulated the area is, or the area within pharmaceuticals is, companies would then need to kind of decide which markets are we going to enter into. Like, are we going to expand into Africa? What do the rules look like there? What is the need for this medicine? If you want to sell, for example, Ozempic in a third world country, I don't know if that would necessarily be kind of the best thing to do versus your first worlds or countries that actually are very rich. So it's just little things like that where they need to kind of and really sit down and think about their strategy when it comes to such things. And I think also they need to also manage their risk properly as well, because it's so highly regulated and it's ever changing. It's the world of science, right? They need to now manage what's going to happen if the government one day decides to say we're no more doing this because we found that it's harmful, or whatever the case is. So they constantly need to be kind of at the edge of modern medicine and scientific research to say that we kind of know where the space is going to go in the next few years, and therefore we need to start being proactive about it. So those are the kind of things that they need to look at.
I sometimes giggle because, as you know, I'm based in the US, and when I listen to the adverts when it comes to pharmaceuticals, when they're promoting something, for example, for eczema, you would think it's just a topical cream that you can use, and then they list the side effects, and then you're listening to heart attack, stroke, possible death, and I'm like, why would you on earth would you promote product? Yes, and I'm like, this is for eczema. Why would you say that it's going to cause death and stroke? But it's because there's a governing body that needs to let you know about all the possible side effects, because this is very important when it comes to risk. And I think the same thing happens in Africa and around the world, is that it's important for the governing bodies that overlook it. So it's SAPRA, for example, to say what we're putting out is going to be safe for our people and going to be fine. From a scientific point, I'm going to leave you with this. As long as they do not touch the ingredients of Vicks. Vicks is my lifesaver. Vicks is life. If you touch it, there's never been a single... The Vicks is my fighter. Friend, it goes everywhere, even hiking. If they found me in the middle of a hike and they open my bag, what did Sureshni Rider bring? Sunblock? and Vicks and a tea bag. How I will survive the jungles, I have no idea, but Vicks is my fighter. So at least we know about that, and at least it must never change. Please, I beg, it must never change. We discussed at the very beginning of the actual segments that we were recording that taxation is one of the very important pillars that you study when it comes to accounting. I know it can be a swear word to many South Africans right now because everyone's struggling and wondering how does the two-pot system works and how it's going to affect you. But let's specifically talk in South Africa about the pharmaceutical industry and how it is subjected to various tax principles which impact how companies manage their finances, particularly in relations to R&D activities, imports and sales of pharmaceutical products. Let's talk tax, B. Explain to me what are some of the key South African tax principles that actually apply to the pharmaceutical industry.
So like everyone else, they're subject to a tax rate of 27% at the time of filming this video. And I think one thing that's very interesting about this particular industry is that they also have kind of their own deduction from the Income Tax Act. So Section 11D of the Income Tax Act speaks particularly to research and development, right? So it's a tax incentive of sort to say that if you're now contributing to scientific knowledge or innovation or whatever the case is, you can then claim deductions using this section. And it actually allows you to claim up to 150% of your original cost. So they're essentially incentivizing innovation, scientific research, adding to the knowledge that we have. So this is one area that pharmaceuticals really benefit from.
B, I really wish I took accounting. I did it up until I think a certain, maybe the 8th grade 8, I think. I wish I did more because I think where I would have
doing my
loved,
good for society, Sush.
Yes. I know, girl. You're my fighter. You're the Vicks. You're the Vicks, my friend. You're the one we chose. You know what I think for me in this whole course that I love the most is the auditing and the ethical part and ethical issues in every industry that we tackle. Because I think for me as a consumer or just as a South African, I just want to know that we're doing the right thing and we're doing right by the consumers of South Africa. You know, myself as somebody who is diabetic and needs specific medication, this is an important industry for me because I've had to fork out so much money between myself or having parents who are diabetic and desperately need to be on insulin or need to be on certain drugs, etc. We know how important that is. And I think even if an average man and a young woman in this who are watching us right now needs access to medication, you know, you're going to understand how it all falls into place when it comes to the auditing and ethical. And that's why you're going to ask, like, how come I'm paying so much? How come I don't have access to it? These are important questions. B, let's begin with auditing and ethical issues. Take me through it.
So I think if you look at, say, the role of auditors in particular, and if we think about just how sensitive the industry of big pharma is, right? If someone wants to falsely get a drug out in the market, one thing they can do is falsify their clinical trial data, right? But that would be obviously bad for you and me as the users of this medicine because it did not go through the actual kind of due diligence. So that's an area of compliance that auditors could potentially look at to say, you know, what controls surround how you arrive at this data and how you then eventually make this drug available to the market. And also the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated. The auditors are also there to kind of say, you know, SAPRA says at a minimum you need to be doing 1, 2, 3. Are you guys then doing this? Because if you're not, then technically you should not be within this industry. You should not be selling anything of yours to kind of anyone. And I think a big ethical issue within big pharma is a concept called evergreening. So evergreening is where, remember we spoke about earlier about the fact that they can patent something and then for 20 years, no one's kind of allowed to copy that medication. They are the sole distributors and owners of that particular process or that particular medication, right? So evergreening is where they come in and they change something so small within kind of the original plans and then want to extend that patent even further, right? So the type of things that they could change is stuff like they could say, you know, they're changing the dosage form. So it was a pill initially that we patented, but now we also want to make it an injectable, right? Therefore,
So they've kind
it
of
kind of feels
changed the
like
product. They
another
upped it.
product. Exactly, but it's actually still
The
the
same
exact
thing.
same thing. But now you have another 20 years that other smaller players are not able to touch that product. They're not able to create a
Yeah,
generic of it.
can't do that.
It's the
It
ghetto.
doesn't seem. Okay, so what happens? Let's look at the South African context, right? Let's say one of the
Yeah.
biggest issues would be TB and access to HIV or AIDS medication. What happens then?
Yes.
What about the costs for that? Or
So
what
if a
about the
South
changes?
African, so if a South African pharmaceutical had a patent to say HIV medication, and they're the only one that can sell that particular type of HIV medication, and they're now engaged in this evergreening business, where they just change something small within the actual initial medication, then that means for the next 20 years, again, no one would be able to manufacture a generic, right? So they could continue charging. Maybe within South Africa, they'd be limited by the single exit price that we discussed earlier. But then if they're exporting to a country where there's no laws and no anything surrounding that, then they could essentially just keep getting rich and richer. So it's such a contentious
Wow.
issue within South Africa in particular that our government is actually against it. They try and have mechanisms to kind of fight it, but it's the big problem just within the world of big pharma in the world. This is
Wow.
a practice that they heavily engage in, and that's how you end up with non-legal generics, so people just kind of doing backdoor things where they manufacture the
Yeah.
thing but kind of sell it in the black market, which also doesn't help anyone as well.
Wow. Well, I do hope there's lots of pushback from government and more importantly, as us as consumers to understand concepts like this. And, as you as students learning about evergreening, it isn't a topic or a concept that is new to all of us in terms of how we speak colloquially. Not everybody knows about evergreening. If we talk about climate change, everybody knows about climate change, but a term like evergreening or understanding the pharmaceutical industry, this is new. This is why information and the distribution of information is so important, and unpacking topics like this is so vital in understanding our rights as South Africans and as human beings. Bee, as always, such a pleasure catching up with you on accounting, all accounting for. I always learn so much. I cannot wait to unpack more industries and see what you have next. Thank you so much for being part of All Accounting For with myself and Bee, proudly brought to you by Boston Media Broadcasts.